Hello and welcome to Comic Boom, the comics and education podcast. If you're interested in hearing more about the crossover between comics and education, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Lucy Starbuck-Radley, and each week I'll be joined by a fellow educator, an academic, a librarian or a creator of comics to discuss their journey into comics and provide some inspiration to influence your practice. And hopefully as well shine some light on some titles you can bring into your libraries, classrooms and also onto your bookshelves at home. I'm so sorry for missing an episode last week. I wasn't feeling very well. I had a really bad cough. So I'm sorry for missing that. But back this week, I'm feeling much better and ready to share the next episode. Really excited that today, in the last of our Lakes International Comics Art Festival link-up episodes, I speak to Mary Talbot. Dr. Mary Talbot is the author of the graphic novel Daughter of Her Father's Eyes, published by Jonathan Cape in 2012, and illustrated by her husband, award-winning comic artist Brian Talbot. She's an internationally acclaimed scholar who has published widely on language, gender and power, particularly in relation to media and consumer culture. Daughter was her first work, which she undertook in a graphic novel format, and it went on to win the 2012 Costa Biography Award in January 2013, making it the first British graphic novel to win a major literary award. Mary has recently taken up the position of Visiting Professor of Graphic Writing in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. Now, Mary's books are pitched for older readers, not something you would typically find on your primary or even younger age groups of secondary classroom bookshelves or libraries. I think more for the upper end of secondary and beyond, definitely for adult readers. But my chat with Mary today offers some great insight, and I think it's brilliant to be able to shine a light on the breadth of work that's out there in comics, going from Beano in 1 week to a literary biography writer in the next, and I just think that's brilliant to be able to celebrate that range that's out there in comics. This episode has been a bit delayed, not just by me being unwell, but Mary and I had some technical difficulties at first, and then some of the October slots were already agreed with other people for their episodes going out. So it is a bit later than we expected, but that's worked out really nicely because alongside Mary's interview, I'll also, at the end of the episode, be sharing some of my thoughts about the things that I bought and saw whilst I was at Lakes International Comics Art Festival at the start of October, and that will follow Mary's interview. For now, though, here's what Mary had to say. Hello, Mary. Welcome to Comic Boom.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
You are very welcome. It's great to have you. I start the podcast by asking guests to just give us a little bit of an introduction into their journey as a comics reader, first of all. When did you first start to explore comics as a reader?
Oh, gosh, a long time ago. I used to get Bunty. I don't know if anybody knows what Bunty is these days, but
I'm familiar with Bunty.
I had a subscription to Bunty. It was delivered every week. I used to go across the backs and read the neighbours' copies of the Beano and Dandy and sometimes Topper, I seem to remember. My eldest brother got the Eagle, but I was a bit too young to look at that. He's 11 years older than me. And then later on, I guess when I started secondary school, a publication called Jackie came out, which was basically for, almost teens. It was full of posters of pop stars and things like that, but it had comic strips in it. Don't remember much about them. It was only years later when I met Purita Campos in Spain when I realised it was her artwork that I used to be looking at. As I say, I don't remember the stories, but I do remember the pictures. They were beautiful.
Was it the pictures that drew you into comics first of all, or was it a combination of the both?
They were just part of growing up. I mean, I didn't continue reading them apart from that until I met Brian when I was just turning 16, and he introduced me to Spider-Man and such like.
And were you instantly hooked as the superhero genre something that you...
No, not exactly.
Were interested in?
It was fun. It was fun. I was a teenager. It was fun. But no, it didn't last. Since then, I mean, until relatively recently, my contact with comics was entirely via Brian and Brian's aspiring ambitions as a comic artist himself.
And so what are you reading at the moment? What's currently part of your reading diet?
Oh gosh, in relation to comics or more generally?
Well, either. You can, happy to hear about
Well, I've just
everything, really.
finished reading a biography. No, not really a biography. Sort of autobiographical piece called In Search of Mary, which is by B. Rowlett, and it's about Mary Wollstonecraft.
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of an exploration of where feminism's got to, whether we should continue to call it feminism, that sort of thing. Very interesting, actually. Extremely funny in places and makes you cry in others. That's what I've been reading, other than comics. And I've just started reading something extremely silly, which is a comic. It's a BD, actually, a French one.
Oh, lovely.
And it's called, to translate, How I Became Radicalized as a Feminazi. We've been in Paris recently. Brian's had a book published there, and he was doing a signing in a French bookshop. 4.5 hours signing, which gave
Wow.
a lot of time to browse.
And you've stumbled across that title.
I stumbled across Comment je me suis radicalisée en féminazie, but it's extremely silly. I don't know whether I'll finish it.
Are you reading that in French?
Yes.
Oh, amazing.
Yes.
Very talented.
It's very Franco-Belgian style. I can't understand a lot of it because it's very, very colloquial. But never mind.
So I'm interested in how you came to be a writer of comics and how that kind of links up as well with your academic work. Can you tell me a little bit about that journey?
I had an independent career from Brian for most of my adult life. I retired in 2009 from being an academic, working in academia and writing textbooks and journal articles and so on, and lectures, of course. And Brian suggested I have a go at writing a graphic novel script. The idea being that he would illustrate it, which I was extremely surprised by, very flattered by. He had a definite idea that it would be memoir, graphic memoir. He was very much aware of the rise of the women's graphic memoir.
Yeah.
And he thought that the two of us could produce an addition to that. He was even specific about the topic, which would be to do with my relationship with my father. I mean, we've known one another all our lives. You know, he knew my dad, was terrified by him, as everybody was. I mean, so there was never any thought about what format the story was going to be in. It was going to be a comic, obviously. And he was going to illustrate it, which was great. And it was intended to be a one-off, but I was bitten by the bug. Before I'd even seen A Daughter of Her Father's Eyes, as it became, in print, I was working on the second one. I knew I wanted to do something that would occupy my retirement leisure time fruitfully, which was...
That's so interesting. And I'm really fascinated by, I guess, the inspiration to write about yourself coming from somebody else.
I was really surprised. I thought nobody wants to know about me.
Yeah, that's something that we discussed quite a lot on the podcast in terms of that. How do you get to that point where you think, actually, I've got something that someone else, a part of my life would be something interesting to someone else.
And even when I'd started it, I was embarrassed. I knew that it had to be honest. And it had to have, revelations in it and things like that, which I suppose it does. And I was hiding behind alternatives. I was thinking, well, it's got a James Joyce element because my father was a Joycean scholar. I thought, well, James Joyce had a daughter, I think. Her name was Lucia. I'll try and see if I can find out about her. And I was fortunate that there was a really good biography recently published, not long ago, published about her. And I was blown away by the tragedy of her life, and I wanted to write about her. And eventually, I think what I produced was better than either of them would have been individually, producing a combination of graphic memoir and biography of someone else.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It definitely brings something additional than having the stories sort of intertwined in the way that they are.
Yeah, and it stopped me from feeling embarrassed about just focusing on me.
Yeah,
I don't know what that says about me.
I interviewed Sarah Begum, and she's written a graphic memoir, I'm sure you're aware. But her way of kind of dealing with that was to create to give the character that is her and it's her life, but a different name from her. So it's almost
a beautiful book too. It's extraordinary. You're talking
stunning.
about mongrel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Absolutely stunning. And I mean, I guess that leads me on to something I really wanted to explore with you, which is around, there's such a strong body of work when it comes to female memoirs now. And you mentioned, Brian, kind of highlighting that was something that was growing that you should add to. And to me, it's something that I really love. It's kind of what brought me back into reading comics. I read them when I was younger, and then there was a big gap, and then that was what sort of bring me back into them as an adult.
There's a lot more to interest women than there used to be.
Yeah. But I think it feels like quite a perfect sort of marriage of form and content. And I just wondered what you think makes those kind of the female comic biography or autobiography so successful.
It's not one thing, I don't think, but there's an emotional punch that you can get across with the visual element to the narrative. I think is the combination of words and pictures, visual and as well as textual narrative, is very, very strong. An emotional punch that you can get across with image that you can't you can, but not in the same way with textual narrative purely. There's a whole subgenre of confessional comics, aren't there, which exploit that. Am I thinking of something like Billy, You and Me? It's an amazing, harrowing account of losing a child as a toddler, losing a small child, dealing with grief, and it's drawn in a very naive style, which somehow makes it bearable. But there's very much this confessional to it. I mean, she brings in found objects of the last bib that was used for the child, and she puts a photograph of it in. I think she might use the death certificate in there as well. I mean, it's somebody sort of being the therapist on the page.
Yeah,
I think that's something that this graphic memoir can do. And then there's another one. Do you know Coma? Sarah Slattery's Coma.
No.
It's about being in a coma. Believe it or not. It's a combination of her partner, husband, whatever, her life partner. When Zara went into a coma, he was advised to keep a journal so that he could show it to Zara if and when she came out of her coma, which obviously she did.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of that and Zara's experiences of inside her own head. And it's amazing.
Wow, that sounds really cool. Yeah. That sounds really fascinating.
You can imagine the use of visual metaphor.
Yeah.
She metaphorically imagines her coma and her fears.
That sounds really powerful. And you spoke about being in the therapist chair, but on the page. Did you find that it was a cathartic experience working on your own memoir? It
was such a long time in the past. Bear in mind that I was writing about what was happening in the 50s and the 60s mostly. The book came out in 2012, so we're talking about a very, very long view. So I think I'd already worked through
processed.
I must say, I would hope so after all that time. I must say, after reading about Lucia Joyce, I felt as though my troubles are very small, very trivial ones. Yeah, so it put things in perspective, I suppose, for me.
That's really interesting. You mentioned that you were an academic throughout your career. Does that work inform your creative work? Are you thinking about your work from an academic perspective as well as your writing, or are they quite separate?
I certainly use a lot of the academic skills that one needs, such as doing a lot of research, reading around a subject. I'm probably getting sloppy about making notes, but that's my business now. It doesn't matter. Because I'm doing it to please myself. I'm not doing it for an specifically academic audience. I'm certainly not doing it for some sort of research assessment exercise for a university anymore.
Yeah.
I suppose a hangover of academic writing is I always do end notes. It's the academic that comes out, maybe. I don't like not including information which I think is useful just because I can't fit it into a narrative. So I'll try and squeeze it into an end note. And people have said that they appreciate that. They like to sort of take the story a bit further. I've done that with Sally Heathcote's Suffragette and with the Red Virgin, which is about 19th century feminists and revolutionary history in France. I've done it with Rain to a lesser extent, which is a contemporary story about environmental issues. And I'll be doing it with whatever the next one is. So I think that
you're involved at Lancaster University in graphic narratives. Can you tell me a little bit about your work there as we're talking about academia? What's your role?
Yes, it was a great honour, a great pleasure to be invited to be a visiting professor of graphic writing, they sometimes call it, graphic narrative, I call it, comics we really mean. But I'm doing a bit of everything. I've had some contact with PhD students, also doing creative writing to do with graphic novels. At the other end of the spectrum, if you like, I've done a lecture to first year students. Trying to infiltrate the curriculum.
In what ways? What's your aim?
No,
what would be your sort of must-haves that you'd like to see in the curriculum?
Well, to be honest, to be fair, there already is some presence of comics in the core curriculum, which is I was very surprised by. The first year core module to English literature students, Fun Home is in there.
Oh yeah.
Which is, and in the second or third year, there's Mouse and there's Persepolis. There's a sort of developing canon of graphic novels.
Yeah, I was going to say if those are probably the three most common that
Dotter is in there somewhere as well. Daughter of Her Father's Eyes.
Oh, that's good.
Great. I'd like to extend that. I see my role as expanding the understanding of what graphic novels, comics more generally can be in this context. The lecture I did to first years was following on from the Fun Home, Alison Bechdel's book, and I was talking about graphic memoir as a genre, and saying something about its history and its range. Well, it's not just a single one-off book that appears in the curriculum. It's part of a big tradition of its own. I try and do that sort of thing.
I'm really intrigued by the term graphic narratives. I did a course actually with Sarah Lightman at the Royal Drawing School, and it was called Graphic Narratives. And you mentioned what we really mean is comics. Why do you think there is these kind of different terms? Do you think graphic narratives is something different to comics, or do you think it actually is the same thing? It's just a slightly fancier name. What's your thoughts on that? It's just being fancy.
Name, isn't it? I know why they use it in corporate circles, public-facing aspects, parts of universities. I know why it's used there. It's because comics is a bit of a snarl word in the media. Can be anyway, and I think that they're just trying to get around that. I was interviewed when I got the position at Lancaster. I was interviewed by local radio, and that's the first thing they did. Brought up the C word, which of course I just faced them head on with because it's silly. It really is.
Yeah.
But actually the word comics in itself doesn't help, does it?
Yeah, it's a bit of a misnomer in itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
Related to humour in a way that just doesn't represent the nature of everything that's been.
Indeed. Mind you, if you look into these words, novel isn't very good, is it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Word novel is a bit rubbish because they've been around for centuries.
Yeah, very true, very true. We just kind of live with the language. Whenever I have a writer, comics creator on the podcast, I always like to talk a little bit about how people create. And you've obviously got the added element of being in a kind of creative partnership with your husband. I'm really interested in how that works. So you said in terms of your debut book, Daughter of Her Father's Eyes, that the idea actually came from Brian. How do you kind of work? I can't imagine it. I cannot imagine. I can't even. If my husband works from home for a day, I'm like, why is he typing so loudly? Why is he breathing over there?
We live in a big house. He's in the basement and I'm on the second floor.
Okay, this is making me a bit more relaxed about the situation.
And we have an intercom system and email, of course, which we do. So one important thing is to have lots of space.
Yeah, I can imagine. So how does it work? Do you write a script or does it develop a bit more organically than that?
In brief, I develop a full script and hopefully get a contract before Brian's involved.
Brilliant.
But of course, we live in the same house, even though we do have office and studio space and study space a long way apart. We do meet in the middle to eat,
Discuss the work
regularly and the sort of domestic stuff. So obviously we're talking about things on a daily basis. But to put it simply, yes, I do a lot of research. At some point I start writing a script and carry on doing the research. Eventually I'll complete the script and show it to Brian. And he'll suggest changes and I'll go back again. Yeah, and it goes on like that. But I have something finished before Brian takes a look at it.
And then is it very much a handing over, or is there also a feedback process on the imagery? Because there's an interesting element in Daughter of Her Father's Eyes as well, where there's like little notes where you think something's been depicted incorrectly. I loved those. I really enjoyed that. And is that something that just kind of developed through the process rather than something that was planned from the start?
Well, it definitely wasn't planned from the start, but you can imagine that when you're working on a project and you're in the same house, it's very organic. I could see what Brian was doing when he took a look at the script and started putting it onto the page. I could see what he was doing. He had it on his drawing board. And so, of course, I could comment on it, which I did freely. Mostly I was seeing it on a daily basis, if not hourly basis.
Yeah.
On one or two occasions, for some reason, I didn't. There was one. The first time was when he was drawing a page of me in school, and at the top of the page it says "School imposed total segregation" or something. I'm talking about gender here.
Yeah.
And he'd drawn boys and girls sitting together,
yeah,
as they did at his primary school.
Yeah.
And so I said, "Oh, you're going to have to redraw that, Brian. That's wrong." And he said, "I'm not redrawing it. It's taking me ages. I like that panel. I'm not redrawing it." So he had what I thought was a very silly idea of me putting a little comment about him having got it wrong. But we did that anyway, and it worked well. And we showed it to people who visited, family, friends visiting. They always burst out laughing at that point. So we asked them, "What is it you're laughing at?" And they said, "Oh, it's this comment here where Mary's pointing out that you've got it wrong. It's really funny." So we thought, aha.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Through looking at bits where we disagreed.
I love it because it's that kind of breaking the fourth wall kind of.
Put a few more in. Yes, it works really well. You can hear the husband and wife squabbling, can't you?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Reviewers, they all seem to pick up on them. And one of them even called it Joycean metatextuality or something of the sort.
There we go. Rather than bickering. You mentioned earlier a comic, Rain, around the impact of climate change. And one of the things, there's actually some really interesting, lots of different themes coming out of this season of Comic Boom, one of which is around climate change comics. I was really interested, you've referred to the idea behind Rain having an element of education by stealth, and I'm fascinated by that and the role that you think that narratives and comic narratives in particular can have in education.
Oh, that's a big question.
Sorry, just to hit that one.
Well, comics, graphic narratives, you can get across very complex, complicated ideas relatively simply because you've got the picture element, the image element. So for something like with Rain you mentioned, I'm talking about some pretty, well, pardon the pun, dry subjects, such as, the destruction of the water table and the kind of issues that you don't really bring up normally in conversation because they're not very interesting and not very accessible. You can make them accessible if you do it with pictures. So I could talk about what's up with the moorland areas in Yorkshire, which made the catastrophic floods happen. I could do that by having two characters talk to one another about it and have them going around on the moorlands, exploring it and jumping up and down on tussocks and things like this. You can get across things, and then you can stick extra bits in endnotes if you're that way inclined. But you can get across difficult things, not just things to do with climate change, but historical issues. I mean, the suffragette book. I read an awful lot of very dry academic history books, both for that and for the Red Virgin, the other history I've done.
Yeah.
Those things which don't go down too well with the general public, the reading dry history books. You can condense them and put them into an accessible form with a sort of combination of textual and visual narrative. I mean, actually, I've had people thanking me for opening up to them areas of history by presenting them in a way that they could digest, if you like. I mean, you don't have to be dyslexic to find it difficult to read a text.
No, exactly. Yeah.
To read some sort of, academic tome. A lot of people have difficulty. You sort of find your eyes glaze over and slip off the page, and you can't read anymore.
Yeah, one of those moments where you get to the end of the page and you realise you haven't actually taken in anything you've been reading. Your eyes have just been going, and you've only been thinking about what's for dinner.
Yes,
that happens to me quite a lot.
Take half a dozen books like that and transform them into a gripping story that's fun to read. That's
it's so
that's
powerful.
what I think they can offer the educational world.
Yeah, and therefore, in terms of building books into the curriculum, there's a space for comics, outside of the literature curriculum and into the history curriculum, into science, into lots of different areas, geography, because of that, the ability to present information in a really digestible form.
Yeah, I certainly hope that Sally Heathcote's Suffragette has found her way into secondary schools.
Yeah.
That was certainly one wish when I was producing it.
I'm sure it will have. In terms of RAIN, because we've got this Lakes International Comics Art Festival link up, and they're really interested in climate change, comics, and the way in which those two things can intersect. I'm really interested in what it was that inspired you to write that story, and how that project came about.
Oh gosh, that was inspired by current events. I mean, I was searching for a new subject. I've been reading various biographies of so-called lost women of history and not been particularly gripped in terms of them as a subject matter for my next. This was after doing a work on Louise Michel, who's a tough act to follow. She was amazing. The Red Virgin character.
Yeah.
And it was, when was that? Christmas 2015. When in the north of England, there was catastrophic flooding, not so much in the northeast where I'm based, but in the northwest, in Cumbria, Greater Manchester and Yorkshire. And it was coming on the news, and it was really affecting me. And Brian again suggested that perhaps I should be dealing with issues to do with environmental concerns and climate change, since I'm obviously so affected by it. Actually, what he did was he came back from the shop with something, and I said, "Why did you get that? It's got microbeads in it." Nobody'd ever heard of microbeads at the time, apparently. They're now illegal. But I was berating him about having bought a product which wasn't acceptable, in my view. And he was presumably slightly ruffled by me telling him off for buying this. And he sort of riposted with, "This is what you should be writing about. You should not looking for another biographical subject. You should be writing about the environmental issues." Of course, I didn't write about microbeads. I wrote about the contemporary flooding that was going on, looking into it in a specific context of Hebden Bridge and that surrounding area. And there was a sufficient amount of background material for me to put together a story where I could look at.
In terms of the Lakes International Comics Art Festival in general, I know you've been involved, linked with that for quite some time. Can you tell listeners a little bit about your involvement and a bit about the event in general?
Well, Brian and I are two founding patrons of it, two of the three founder patrons of it. Oh gosh, yeah, we've been around from the outset. We had more of a decision-making role at the outset. Now they have a direct, and we're just there as support when it's required, when it's asked for. I mean, writing letters of support and so on to help with funding. And we're always present, happy to take part in whatever way they ask, more or less, within reason.
Can you explain a little bit about, what the purpose of these kinds of festivals are in your view, and what their value is?
Gosh, I think they're incredibly important. They're certainly important for creators. Comics creators are very lonely people, generally speaking. I mean, writers and artists, writer-artists, they spend most of their time alone creating things. I think it's very important as a social event to get people together. Of course, it's also important for the general public, and I hope we'll get bigger than ever turnout from people not just from the Northwest, but nationally and internationally. They're showcases. They're a chance to have a good time. Brian was involved from the beginning, in particular, more so than myself, because it was Brian who was contacted to ask whether it would be a feasible idea to have a European-style festival of comics in the UK. And he was asked by Julie Tate, and within hours he responded with the longest email I've ever seen, a screed of advising her on where she should go and what kind of things that he saw as being part of a European festival. And she just responded to it. She just sort of went for it immediately. She booked herself in at Angoulême. I think he was telling her about Angoulême, about Lucca and various other well-established European festivals. And she got herself booked in at Angoulême, and she'd produced this sort of fully fledged festival within a few months. It was quite extraordinary. And it was because it was Julie Tate who was involved with it, frankly.
One of our questions that we're linking our 3 Lakes International Comics Art Festival special episodes together with is the big one. Do you think comics can change the world?
Oh, can comics change the world? Well, can stories change people?
Yeah, I think so.
Answer a question with another question. I mean, comics, stories with pictures are very better at affecting people's hearts and minds. So yes, of course, comics can change the world.
Brilliant. At the end of each episode, we kind of have a moment where contributors, guests can kind of highlight a few takeouts or just a couple of key points that you'd like to leave listeners thinking about. Have you got any thoughts on what those might be?
Not especially. I have a feeling that we've covered all bases, really, haven't we?
I think for me, really stands out the role that comics can play in terms of communicating things that otherwise might be quite dry or quite difficult to digest, and their ability to kind of bring things to life, and that might not just be within the English curriculum but also outside of it. I think that's the really key thing that's kind of stuck in my mind from our conversation today.
Yes, I think they can be really good as reworkings of dry material. I mean, think of the Rickard sisters, reworkings of No Surrender by Constance Maud. They've turned it into a much more engaging story. And similarly with Ragged Trousers Philanthropist, which is very difficult to read, to work way through in terms of the original text. They've turned it into something very gripping, highly recommended, Yeah, I think there's a wealth of possibility there.
So if we were to add one comic or about comics to our to be read piles tomorrow, which title would you recommend that we added to our lists?
Oscar Zarati's latest. Do you know it?
No, I don't.
Recently published, Thomas Girton, The Forgotten Painter. It's a beautiful book. It's written as Oscar always writes, with passion, and it's intriguing that there's very little out there in terms of biographical material about Thomas Girton. And it's interesting how Oscar's dealt with it. One of the things that's interesting, apart from its intrinsic interest because of the artist, what he's done is he's created 3 fictional characters who are friends at a life drawing class. One of them's obsessed by finding out about this Thomas Girton, and the other 2 are sort of responding to that. And it's really interesting the way he uses these 3 characters to develop this somewhat mysterious, shadowy personage of Thomas Girton, whose art we eventually get to know rather well, even though most of it isn't on display publicly.
I'm just having a little look at that as you speak, and it's really interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. Fascinating, and really interesting to have a sort of visual text about an artist. Well, I would definitely check that one out, although my to be read list is very, very long. It gets longer every single podcast episode. It gets longer and longer and longer.
I know the feeling.
It is hard to keep up. There's so much good stuff out there. But yes, thank you so much for spending time talking to me today. It's been really great to hear all of your knowledge and experience. That's been fantastic. So thank you.
Lovely to talk to you.
There you have it. Thanks so much, Mary, for taking the time to speak to me. Sorry that it took a little bit longer than expected to get your episode out, but I'm so glad to be able to bring it to the Comic Boom audience. I hope you enjoyed that and found Mary's insights as interesting as I did. I did promise to do a bit of an overview of some of the things that I bought and picked up in the marketplace at the Lakes International Comics Art Festival. First of all, a little bit of an overview of the event itself. It's in Bowness on Windermere at the end of September each year. Absolutely brilliant lineup of guests. If you're looking for something a little bit different, it's people from all over Europe, the world, even international, coming to speak about their work. So it's a great place to go to find artists and writers that you might not have heard of. There's lots of different talks. There's a brilliant marketplace with lots of people selling different comics. Also at the Jetty Museum, a full schedule of activities run by Little Licaf, completely free for families to get involved in, with lots of the guests from all around the world, big names in the comics world, doing workshops for free for children. My children had a great time. They went to a workshop with Gustavo Duarte looking at monsters, creating monsters, which they really loved. And they also went to a workshop with Mark Jackson, who has been a guest on the podcast, so check out his episode if you want to hear more about Mark and his work. But he does brilliant activities for children and creates really funny comics. They had a great time there, and they also stocked up on their Mark Jackson collection. We got a couple of extra editions of Spook Kids and other Mark Jackson titles, which they really, really love. And Mark's got a comic strip currently in the Phoenix as well, so if you're not familiar with his work, you can check out his strip in the Phoenix at the moment too. I went to watch a panel on silent comics with guests Gustavo Duarte and Marek Rubec. Gustavo's from Brazil and Marek from Czech Republic, and that was a great talk and got me really, really fired up. I actually love silent comics, but it's definitely something I want to look into more and more. So I really, really enjoyed that one. I also went to talk about up-and-coming artists from across Europe, and I bought some work there. That was a session hosted by Paul Gravett, and it featured the artists Alice VDM from Belgium, Mari Ahokoivu from Finland, Massimo Fanati from Italy, and Annabelle Gourmand, also from Belgium. And they did a live drawing, they talked through their work, they passed books around, and it was great to hear their perspective. It was a bit like a live podcast episode. I absolutely loved that session as well. And I did buy Mari Ahokoivu's book as well, even though at that point I had promised I was no longer going to buy any more comics. That my comics budget was gone. I reopened the comics budget to get Mari's book. So I'll start by talking about that one. I bought Oxy by Mari Ahokoivu. It's really, really beautiful, based on Finnish folklore. A lot of silent, but it's not a silent comic, but there's a lot of passages and pages in there where there's not much dialogue going on. Very intense. When you look at it, I think the artwork the main characters are bears and forest creatures, and it looks quite cute, but actually behind that there's a lot of darkness, there's shadow creatures, and it's a very complex story. I found myself having to spend quite a long time with the images to really bring the narrative out of them, but I really enjoyed that. I liked that it wasn't telling me everything immediately, and I had to kind of spend some time with it. So it's quite a substantial book. I'd say it was because of the complexity of the narrative and the meaning within the images. I'd say it was for older readers from 16 plus, but enjoyed that one. One that Mary recommended to me that at the time I hadn't read because I interviewed Mary before I went to Licaf, but when I was there I actually met Zara Slattery and bought her book Coma from her, and I devoured it. As Mary said, it's an autobiography about her time in her life when she was in a coma and was ill, and her family and how they coped with that on the outside of the coma as well. And it is stunning. The imagery is beautiful. The story is really, really well told. I very much recommend. I think that's I read a lot of comic autobiographies and biographies, and I think this is one of my favourites that I've ever read, so that's definitely gone to the top of my list. I wholeheartedly recommend that. I also found some people that I wasn't aware of before, which is always brilliant. So I picked up Haru by Joe Latham. He had the first 3 volumes there on his table. He did say that it is being made into a graphic novel over the next couple of years. And he had the first 3 volumes. I only bought the first volume, more for me, because I was left wanting more at the end to know what happened next in the story. Some really beautiful illustrations, little, again, sort of fantasy, forest creatures, but there is a little bit of darkness in there as well. Something untoward is happening. We don't really know what, and in this edition, but there's definitely themes building that this little bird character Haru is going to come up against some challenges. But yeah, the colour and the illustrations very, very beautiful. Another one that I really, really loved was a little silent comic, a funny silent comic called The Fat Little Boulder by Luke Hyde, and I'll put all links to these people's websites and social media in the podcast Padlet so that you can check them out. But this is just a really delightful, funny little story about a boulder who wants to be part of something bigger. He wants to be part of a stone circle, and things do not quite go as planned, but really lovely storytelling, funny, and just relying on the visuals to tell that narrative, and I really enjoyed it. Another thing I picked up was, I love Lucy Sullivan, already a big fan of Lucy Sullivan and her graphic novel Barking, and I picked up, Lucy was there, had a nice chat with her, and picked up some zines that she had made, which were just stunning, beautiful pictures. The colours are incredible, and you can fold them as well, to fold them in different ways to make letter shapes. Just witty and powerful, and I love zines. I love the handmade nature, the kind of immediacy, the way that they come from the heart. And I really enjoyed these zine collection called How to Build a Free Woman. Yeah, definitely recommend those. Lots of this stuff you can buy online from the creators directly themselves. So do check out the Padlet with links if you like the sound of any of those. Those are all things that I recommend. You can enrich your comics bookshelf with those. Really, really good. Thank you so much for listening today. I really appreciate everyone who tuned into old episodes last week when there wasn't an episode. Thank you so much for that. Please do keep continuing to share the podcast on social media. We're on Instagram on @comic_boom_podcast. You can also support the podcast, help keep us on the airwaves, and you can do that by going to ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/LucySB, and there you can buy my own comic artwork, and you can also make a donation to support the podcast by way of thanks for all the free content that's out there. Completely optional, but very much appreciated. Thanks for all of your support and for tuning in. You've been listening to Comic Boom, which is hosted and produced by me, Lucy Starbuck Bradley. Thanks for listening.